A day after the audacious U.S. military operation in Venezuela, President Donald Trump on Sunday renewed his calls for an American takeover of the Danish territory of Greenland for the sake of U.S. security interests. The comments from Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio after the ouster of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro underscore that the U.S. administration is serious about taking a more expansive role in the Western Hemisphere. With thinly veiled threats, Trump is rattling hemispheric friends and foes alike, spurring a pointed question around the globe. Who's next? On who is next, President Trump said Colombia is very sick too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the U.S. Now, he was referring to Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro. Trump told this to reporters on Air Force One. Well, for more updates and analysis of the developments of the capture trial and the trial of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, we have Arise special correspondent James Blue joining us now. Great to have you join the program. Thank you for joining Newsday, James Blue. So we're just going to reestablish audio, but I wanted to ask you, this has been described as kidnapping, extrajudicial rendition from a standpoint of international law. How does the U.S. justify seizing a sitting head of a state, sovereign nation on foreign soil?
What the United States is going to argue that there were these indictments that were outstanding, and that President Maduro and his wife were they're sort of subject to sort of U.S. jurisdiction. This is being portrayed as a law enforcement activity that was assisted by the U.S. military. If you look at the sort of perp walk yesterday, President Maduro was actually escorted by DEA agents. We've seen very few kind of military people in his presence, and that's very deliberate because the idea is that this was a U.S. Law enforcement activity that was supported by the U.S. military, and therefore it is sort of what the U.S. is going to argue legal. Certainly, the UN Charter, and the U.S. is a signatory and has endorsed the UN Charter, says that it is not lawful to go into other countries unless being asked or unless there's sort of a direct threat. And so I think that's likely to be taken up today at the Security Council. However, as you know, the U.S. is a member of the Security Council and will likely veto. And so there you see, there you see President Maduro and his wife being escorted, and you can see on the back of the shirts there, it says DEA. And so I think they are going to make a very big case that this was a DEA, an FBI operation that was only assisted and supported by the U.S. military.
And many are drawing parallels to the 1989 capture of Manuel Noriega from Panama. Now, does this case, that case, does it provide enough of a solid legal blueprint in terms of today's trial for Nicolas Maduro and his wife? Or have the international norms developed past that? Have they evolved enough to make this a little bit more of a riskier move to maneuver in court?
Well, I'm not sure it's a riskier move to maneuver in court because they're going to rely on the same document that allowed them to get Manuel Noriega. So back during the first Bush administration, this is George Herbert Walker Bush. This was, I believe, what happened. There was a memo that was written by the Department of Justice, basically outlining the reasons and the particulars of why President Bush had the authority beyond the UN Charter to go into Panama and to arrest Manuel Noriega, who was the sitting president of Panama. But this situation is very different because at the time, the U.S. had a very large military presence in Panama because of the Panama Canal. And so there were assets and there was sort of the ability to kind of maneuver there that was different than in going into Venezuela. It's the same rationale that the U.S. president has a calling and authority to uphold the U.S. Constitution, which requires him to seek justice and requires him to hold up and to execute this arrest warrant. And so that is, I think, the basis that they're going to use. Is likely because this is the Trump administration that they've developed some additional rationale. We don't know what that is yet, but we will certainly hear some of this today during the initial appearance in court, in the federal court here in Manhattan later this morning.
And the president, Donald Trump, has stated that the U.S. will run the country until transition occurs. What does running a sovereign nation look like in 2026 without it becoming a full-scale, long-term military invasion?
Well, I mean, there's not a military invasion. I think that's one of the things that's very important and distinct about this. There are no U.S. military forces on the ground in Venezuela right now. And I think the hope is that the vice president, who's now the interim president, and the former cabinet will cooperate with the United States and really implement the policies that they're hoping to have implemented. That would give them the ability to continue without having to send troops on the ground. Venezuela is a very large country. Western Venezuela is very unlawful. There are gangs and all sorts of things there. And so I think the United States wants to go a big distance before actually putting troops on the ground. And I don't think that is something that they would like to do, but they certainly have the plans to do it if it is required. But at the moment, there are no U.S. troops on the ground.
Right. And this operation, as large as it was, is being framed as a massive win for the administration's America First doctrine. How will the success of this high-stakes military operation change the political temperature inside of the U.S., also as you all head towards the next election cycle?
I think it is quite stunning that they've done this without any casualty, and it was done precisely. And President Maduro and his wife will appear in court this morning. And so I do think there is some sense that this was a success, and it was a success. Certainly, there were some helicopters that were fired on. There were some injuries, but there are actually no deaths on the U.S. side. We think there are about 80 deaths inside Venezuela. In terms of the political implications, it's too early to tell. The America First kind of agenda of the second Trump administration, they are kind of couching this in America First and trying to create safety within the hemisphere. Perhaps that will work. We're not sure. But I think if there are additional troops that have to be moved in, if there are American casualties, if there is sort of the overreach that really plagued both Afghanistan and Iraq, I think the American public will sort of turn against this. At the moment, the American public is very supportive of the troops who carried this out, who did it successfully. And of course, whenever there is a dictator, whenever there is someone who is sort of out of bounds, who is facilitating the movement of drugs, I do think there is a sense that that person, if possible, should be dealt with. And I think there is likely some sigh of relief that Maduro is not someone we have to worry about moving forward. And so I think that should have political dividends, yes.
Yeah, and the after effects for those that are anti-U.S., like the other anti-U.S. leaders around the region, such as Cuba and Nicaragua, how are they likely to react? We're wondering if it's going to serve, this action serves as a deterrent, or whether or not it's going to trigger some kind of defensive regional alliance against this perceived northern aggression.
Look, I think that the Trump administration has put Cuba, put Colombia on notice that they may be next, and so I think it's going to make everyone cautious. No one wants to get into the crosshairs of the United States, and I think that was one of the goals of this America First policy, to show that the U.S. is willing to use its power, to use its force, to strike wherever it can and whenever possible. And so I do think that there will be caution to make sure that the sort of effort in Venezuela is successful, is actually moving, and most importantly, is pumping the oil. I think one of the real headlines out of this is that your country doesn't necessarily have to worry unless there is a strategic commodity or actual resource that the United States may want to have. And so throughout this conversation, you've not heard this as being, let's restore democracy, let's sort of get the Venezuelan people what they want. It has been totally focused on how do we get U.S. Oil interests satisfied in Venezuela. And so that's why I think countries like Cuba and Nicaragua, they certainly should worry, but since they are not resource rich in the way that Venezuela is, I think the threat is much, much less.
And that's actually a very good point. Now back to Maduro and his wife. They're being tried in the Southern District of New York, as we saw in the videos in the perp walk. What are the unique challenges of finding a jury, an impartial jury, for a man that is very public and has been a central villain in the U.S. foreign policy debate for decades even?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a problem finding a jury. I think there are a number of people who have very little idea who Nicolas Maduro is. I think the real issue will be the time they have to serve. This will be a very long trial. It'll be a very complicated trial. They probably won't actually get to opening arguments until next year. I just think that's the complexity of it. And I think if you're Maduro's lawyer, what you're going to try to do is stretch it out so that there will be, at some point, someone will be able to say, well, hasn't he served enough? Hasn't he done enough? Can't we just sort of let him go? But this is not a quick process. And so the real challenge, if people are called, is going to be, get ready, you're going to be here for a while. So they will be using alternates. They will be letting people substitute, go in and out, simply because it is such a large time commitment.
And just before I let you go, the indictment centers around narcoterrorism and the cartel of the Suns. How much of the U.S. case relies on testimonies? I guess maybe I've been watching a lot of documentaries and movies, but how much of this case is going to rely on the testimonies of his former associates, and how many of those associates could have possibly been compromised, such as Hugo El Polo Caraval and others?
Yeah, look, I think this is going to rely on people who know Maduro, people who've been involved in his administration, people who have been involved in the actual drug running. And I do think that they will testify. They may not testify in open court. They may need to do it remotely, simply for their safety. But I do think Maduro is, as he should be, going to be able to face his accusers and actually respond to their accusations. And so I don't think there's going to be a problem in getting witnesses to testify, because I do believe there are a large number of people who believe their families have been infected, and damaged by the flow of drugs from Venezuela. So I think there will be Venezuelans, and I think there will be Americans, and I think that is a real sort of interest group who have firsthand knowledge of what went on, and I think they will talk.
Well, it was great having this chat with you. Thank you so much for joining us on Newsday, James Blue, Arise special correspondent.